This is the lecture for European history for Tuesday, the 19th of April, year of our Lord 2022. We last time looked at the various Bolshevik visions of Titlin and his tower, and Malevich, and White on White, the painting, and of course Arseny Avramov on the factory's Siren Symphony that he did with the factories of Baku in the Caucasus. So, those are the visions. But understand, when the revolution actually happens, the visionary theoreticians like the college professors who are all like, yeah, the world would be great under communism, are the first ones to get put up against the wall and shot. Because they're not the kind of revolutionaries the revolution needs. They're a bunch of chatterers. They're the chattering classes. No, what the revolution needs are thugs and men of violence, men of blood. And there's no shortage of them in the stories today. First off, from 1918 until 1922, various forces in Europe refused to accept the Bolshevik revolution as an accomplished fact. After all, if the Tsar can be made to abdicate and the communists can take over, why not us? So, the largest party in Russia is the Socialist Revolutionaries, which is an agrarian peasant party. And the SRs, at first, are partners with the Bolsheviks, but after a while find that the Bolsheviks are destroying them, and they get destroyed. It's not numbers, it's attitude. The Constitutional Democrats, or the Cadet Party, are the basically liberal democratic party, and they are immediately anti-Bolshevik, and they join groups of military officers around the periphery of Russia. The general staff at Mogilev ends up reforming in the lands of the Don Cossacks. The lands of the Don Cossacks are occupied by Cossacks, the great horsemen who've worked for the Tsars for centuries. And there they form a resistance that's going to be one of the major threats to Bolshevik power. But they're not alone. General Denikin in the south is joined by Admiral Kolchak in the east, in Siberia, east of the Urals, who sets up an independent Siberian state with the help of some Czechoslovak prisoners of war who were on their way to join and fight for the Allies against Germany and Austria. They're stuck in Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They rise up against the Bolshevik authorities too. North of Mongolia, there's one of the most bizarre figures of the period, the Baron von Ungen Sternberg. He is an explorer. He's a Russian baron. He is also a Buddhist mystic, and he ends up leading a horde of Mongolians who set up a semi-independent state along the Trans-Siberian Railroad near Mongolia. Vladivostok on the Pacific is occupied by the Japanese and the Americans. In the north, you've got Arkhangelsk, or Archangel, and Murmansk, and they're occupied by the British. General Miller ends up taking the German Courland region away from Russia. Marshal Mannerheim takes Finland away from Bolshevik Russia. General Pilsudski takes Poland away from Russia. And a series of governments in the Ukraine are set up to take the Ukraine away from Russia, most particularly the regime of Hetman Skoropadsky, who runs a right-wing sort of dictatorship in the Ukraine. But in the Ukraine also, you have Nestor Makhno and his anarchists. And this is just to name a few of the players. The Russian Civil War is a hairball. A hairball is what fighter pilots call it when you have dogfights morph into dogfights, morph into dogfights. 3 or 4 dogfights come together, you have a hairball. It is a cluster mess. It is chaos. Civilization is broken down. You've got a variety of military officers. Denikin in the south gets as far as Oryol, south of Moscow. Kolchak, a few months earlier, gets close to the Urals. As Kolchak's army is moving towards the Urals, the Tsar and his family are being kept in isolation. The Tsar did not leave Russia. Under the Republic, he remained, and the Bolsheviks arrested him and put him in an estate in the middle of the countryside. It just so happens near the Urals. So, the local commissar, the local Communist Party officer, made a decision. I believe it was cleared by Lenin and Sovnarkom, which is Lenin's ruling council, and the Tsar and his family are brought down to the basement, and each and every one of them are shot. Thus ends the Romanovs, the imperial family of Russia. Now, the Princess Anastasia was the youngest of the females, of the daughters of the Tsar, Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. There was a woman named Anna Anderson who claimed that she was Anastasia, had escaped, had been spirited out of Russia. And it's a wonderful romantic story that's simply not true. The evidence is that Anastasia was killed along with the rest of her family, unfortunately, by the Bolsheviks. In this war, the highfalutin visions of these Bolsheviks who want to build communism have to succumb to the reality of war. So a system is set up by Lenin and Sovnarkom, his ruling council, called war communism. War communism is the replacing of a monetary economy with a command economy. It's like Egypt under the pharaohs. The pharaoh writes a note to somebody. Farmers will provide food for this person. All food necessary. And the Bolshevik government begins operating like that. They just begin commanding people to do things without pay, without recompense. And everything comes under regulation. Where people live, how many calories they get per day, where they're allowed to travel, what they're allowed to say, what they're allowed to read, what they're allowed to do. All media becomes propaganda. All property is now held in common, but it's held in common under the Bolsheviks. The Communist Party is going to begin deciding everything for everybody in the country. And this is how they fight the Civil War. Now, there is another scene from Dr. Zhivago which shows this pretty well. So, with people by the windows, please close the slats, close the shades. And this. Okay, I'm just walking past you, kid. Puppy.
Call her a kitten.
I did, because I have cats at home.
She eats kittens.
Yeah, she's so fierce.
Probably not.
She's a tough girl.
She chases birds.
She's a dame.
Just meet them though.
She's a Harvard chick.
She needs a haircut.
Okay.
Oh,
I'm sure she loves you talking about her that way.
She does. Everybody, is she a boy or a girl? I don't know.
Is she a boy or a girl? My pronouns are woof and woof.
They automatically assume that she's
How dare you make fun of things like this? It's too serious. Nobody cares. So, let's see.
What is this? It's a movie.
Really?
I just want to know what movie it is, Jade.
Okay, so there's meat.
Come on.
The stove's out.
That's so
No
salty.
more
Okay. I will pause the video and we will see
So
Yuri Zhivago, the doctor from the movie, is coming home to his family's house. I don't honestly remember if it's in Moscow or St. Petersburg. I think it's in Moscow. And you will see what has happened. This is during the Civil War. Yes, I am. Okay. So that's just a small depiction of what had happened to property. He was the young man ready to return to his home, his family home, and there were two commissars waiting to greet him and remind him that his family had profited and lived off of parasitically off of the work of the proletariat, and how it's much more just. And he, you'll learn about the character if you see the movie, is flexible and is certainly willing to be charming and say, yes, it's certainly more just. But they were spoiling for a fight. They were looking to identify the class enemy, the traitor, and set up a situation for his destruction. And of course, there's no typhus in Moscow, just rumor mongering. Oh, there was plenty of typhus in Moscow, and there was starvation, because war communism had a few problems, not the least of which was, why should farmers give up food without payment? A letter from the Bolshevik Soviet, local Soviet committee, saying, yeah, you should give up your food, is not going to give the farmer anything. So during war communism, workers were armed and sent out into the countryside to take the food. They called it appropriation. Most people would call it armed robbery. And the peasants were robbed, and this is where the socialist revolutionaries that represented the peasants turned against the Bolsheviks. Okay. The Civil War is, like any real civil war, a truly wretched experience for all concerned. But the advantage that the Bolsheviks had is centrality. They controlled Rodina. They controlled the homeland, the motherland of Russia, the area around Moscow, and also St. Petersburg. And they never lost control. And because of the way railroads were set up in Russia, the networks met at Moscow and at St. Petersburg. So I should call it Petrograd now. So all of the various forces from around the periphery, Denikin in the south, Kolchak in the east, Udench in the Baltics, ultimately Miller in the north, Pilsudski in Poland, and the various forces vying for control of Ukraine. That's its own giant civil war. They hit the Bolsheviks one at a time. It's like a typically staged Hollywood fight. You've got your hero, Captain America. Why not? Or James Bond or whatever. There's a great scene from a movie called You Only Live Twice, and it's a shot from a crane of James Bond fighting his way across 2 or 3 rooftops in Japan. And unfortunately, the shot was not composed properly. So what you see are the various thugs getting ready to go after Bond after he beats the other thugs. And they only come at him one at a time or in groups of 2 or 3. In reality, they'd swarm him and pigpile on him. They would not wait for him to be ready. Because when you're fighting somebody, you're not trying to be fair. This isn't boxing. This is street fighting. The Bolsheviks have their enemies come at them one at a time. So the Bolsheviks are able to put maximum effort against Kolchak in the east, and then against Denikin in the south, and then against Udench in the Baltics, and Miller in the north, and take control of Ukraine, and then fight Pilsudski. Now, early in the Civil War, Stalin appears at Tsaritsyn, the city of the Tsar, which is later named Stalingrad. We'll talk about him in a few minutes. But Stalin is going to be very important during one of the last phases of what could be called the Russian Civil War. Lenin and Sovnarkom want to spread the revolution to Germany. Karl Marx always said that Germany would be the heart of the world revolution because Germany was the most industrialized place in the world in the late 1800s. Even Britain was being overtaken. So the Soviet Red Army is on its way, having taken over the Ukraine and beaten all the others. It's heading to Europe, but geographically, what's between Russia and Germany? Poland. So, Stalin is supposed to be supporting the main branch of the Red Army attack. But instead, Stalin wants some individual glory. So he diverts forces away from the main thrust at Warsaw, the capital of Poland on the Vistula River, and diverts them to Lublin, or Lvov. This is going to be somewhat important, because in 1920, there is the miracle at the Vistula. The miracle at the Vistula is the Battle of Warsaw between the Soviet Red Army and the Polish National Army under Piłsudski. And at Warsaw, at the Vistula River, the Red Army is stopped and broken and is going to be pushed back deep into White Russia and the Ukraine. And at the end of the war, Poland is going to take a bunch of territory beyond what had been considered Poland, and they'll take some White Russian territory, some Lithuanian territory. Vilnius, for example, which is the capital of Ukraine today, of Lithuania today, was part of Poland. It was called Wilno between the wars. Kaunas was the capital of Lithuania. And this change between a resurgent, victorious Red Army and a Red Army in retreat happened at the Vistula. And it probably would not have happened had Stalin been willing to support the main thrust. But he wasn't, because Stalin. So in any event, the Russians are condemned to live under communism for about 70 years because the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, because they have interior lines and railroads, and their enemies cannot coordinate effectively the timing of their attacks. And after the miracle at the Vistula, the Red Army is not able to do more than hold Russia, and they do. But the Russian Empire and this new Soviet Russia have different borders. Finland is now independent. So is Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. The Ukraine is made a part of Russia again, so it's not independent. However, Romania is given Bessarabia, which includes modern Moldova and the coast, basically the area south of the Dnieper River. So the western frontiers of Soviet Russia are considerably farther east than the western frontiers of the old Tsarist Russian Empire. There are minor changes along the border with the Turks and the Iranians, nothing really to speak of. And the Asian borders. Central Asia is still under Russian Soviet control. What's now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan. Even Mongolia is going to become dominated by Soviet Russia. It's not ever incorporated into the USSR, but it is run from there. And the Russians are going to get involved in China's troubles. So the Reds win the Civil War, the Whites lose. The Whites are the anti-communist forces, the Reds are the communist forces. And after the Russian Civil War, after the Red victory in it, yes?
Why is the, Kazakhstan and all the other ones, why do they end with,
Well, Stan means land of in Turkic, I believe. So Pakistan, land of the faithful, I think. Kyrgyzstan, land of the Kyrgyz tribes. Kazakhstan, land of the... So there's all this. Actually, I don't know if it's Turkic. It might be... I'm not sure what language, but it definitely means place of or land of. Okay. Back when they were talking about dividing India after the British, as the British were leaving, the Muslims always called what we call India Hindustan, because it was going to be dominated by the Hindu majority. So I tend to think it's Turkic because that's the ethnic group that dominates that region of Central Asia, but I could be wrong. Does anyone know? If you find out, I'll count it as extra credit. Look it up, send me information, and that'll be fourth quarter extra credit for you if you want. Okay. Lenin decides that things need to change. Lenin studied very closely the French Revolution, and the Civil War is over. And now the Bolsheviks are left governing, though still the vast majority of the old Russian Empire. But we've got to do, Lenin determines, what the Directory did. We've got to normalize life under Bolshevism. War communism will not work. People are not happy. So Lenin sets up what is called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. Communists and Americans both love combining initials. So the NEP, the New Economic Policy. And the New Economic Policy returns money to the economy, rubles, and also is going to reduce the regulation of industry and of agriculture to allow people to govern their areas communally, under Soviet supervision, but more locally. Under war communism, all decisions were made at the center and implemented in the periphery. Now, each peripheral region, each farm, commune, or group of farmers can make decisions together. Towns and villages can make decisions together. So the NEP is not going to reduce the Soviets, the communists' political control, but it is going to pull back on the regulation to allow people a limited, very limited amount of self-determination. One of the key ways that this self-determination is going to be achieved is in the allowance of tiny little home businesses. Communists are going to allow for the equivalent of lemonade stands, garden stands, vegetable stands, so that farmers who produce more than they absolutely have to will be rewarded. So if a farmer is producing cabbage, and they are industrious and hardworking, instead of getting nothing for it, which is what they would have gotten under war communism, except more of their hard work would be appropriated by the workers' groups that came out with guns. Now, a farmer who's industrious and grows more than the requisite number of cabbages can set up a garden stand in a village nearby or a town nearby and sell them for profit. This is not a return to private enterprise. What it is the allowance of, the permission of the communists to do something against their ideology. They're going to permit the smallest of small businesses to encourage people as an incentive to work harder and to be reconciled to communism. This is something that in the French Republic never really happened. The Directory tried to get the French people to be reconciled to life under the Republic. And then Napoleon came, and it's all about war and conquest. Lenin wants to get the Russian people and the various other peoples of Soviet Russia to be reconciled to communism. So it is a step away from the theories of Marx. It is a step away from totalitarian control. Now, Lenin has a stroke, I think in 1921 or 1922, like Wilson. The stroke is going to be a debilitating one. And Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, who's also a leading communist, and his chief lieutenant, Leon Trotsky, who led the Red Army during the Civil War, are going to try to manage things in his name while he's still around before he dies. But there's a rising person, a rising star in the Communist Party that disturbs Lenin. Yosef Vissarionovich Zhugashvili. Yosef Vissarionovich Zhugashvili is not Russian. He's Georgian. Like Napoleon, who was a Corsican who ended up taking over France, and Hitler, who was an Austrian who ended up taking over Germany, Yosef Vissarionovich Zhugashvili is a Georgian from Asia who will take over Russia. Now, background. Zhugashvili came from a family where he had a doting mother and a somewhat abusive father. And his mother wanted him to become a priest. So she sent Yosef Vissarionovich to seminary to become an Orthodox priest. he hated it. He hated school. He was a discipline problem, and he got himself thrown out. And he was happy to be. Because when he got thrown out of seminary, he discovered, well, in seminary, he learned about how religion can be used to control people. He learned how religious hierarchies work, how dogma worked, and so forth. So he learned the ways that religion operates as a mechanism for control in society. Yay. He then is introduced to his first communists. He loves communism. It's counterculture, it's avant-garde. So soon, Josef Vissarionovich becomes a communist. And he takes on the communist name Koba. If you've seen the new Planet of the Apes movies, the aggressive ape takes Stalin's early revolutionary name of Koba. And Koba is, among other things, a bank robber. He robs banks for the Bolsheviks to raise money. He basically is a hard-working mule. If the job is creative, don't give it to Stalin. If the job is repetitive and sort of grunt work, give it to Koba. And Koba is arrested by the Okhrana, the Russian Tsarist secret police, and sent to Siberia to live in basically exile, internal exile. The war happens, the Tsar falls, and Josef Vissarionovich is free. But he's chosen to change his image. He's changed his revolutionary name from Koba, which is sort of a Georgian hero from olden times, like Paul Bunyan or John Henry. You know, it's that sort of thing, Koba. He's now not going to be Koba. Koba was a young man's fantasy. No. Josef Vissarionovich Djugashvili renames himself Stalin. And Stalin means man of steel. That tells you about the guy more than anything else. What kind of person introduces himself? Hi, I'm Joe Man of Steel. How you doing? Joe Man of Steel. Pleased to meet you. Joe Man of Steel. What the hell? Now, I will tell you, he comes up with this about 20 years before the guy who invents Superman, the comic book hero. There's no question in my mind that the Man of Steel is a nod to Joe Man of Steel, Joseph Stalin. So, Stalin is a rising member of the party. He's not an old Bolshevik. He was not an ancient comrade of Lenin. Lenin barely knew who this guy was. But in the war, he helps protect Tsaritsyn for a while. In the war, he's given responsibility for the attack on Poland, and he screws it up. After the war, he becomes general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know who was just elected secretary, do you? For the ASB?
Emma, she ran unopposed.
Okay, so good for Emma. Good candidate. The secretary is grunt work. It's basically making sure all the party paperwork is set up, making sure the minutes are taken, making sure everything's organized, making sure positions are filled, making sure positions are filled, making sure positions are filled. Stalin turns what is a miserable clerk job into the source of his power. Because what Stalin begins to do is replace local leaders with men loyal to him personally. Soon, the party bureaucracy is not going to be loyal to Trotsky, who won the war for the Reds, and it's not going to be loyal to Lenin even, although everyone's loyal to Lenin, but Lenin's had, is old and he has a stroke. These people are loyal to Stalin. And Stalin's power is growing. One of the last things that's coherent that Lenin says, he has his good moments and bad after the stroke, and it becomes worse as time goes on, is Stalin is too rude. Do something about Stalin. Stop it. So Lenin at the last realizes there's something dangerous about this man. But he dies, and Lenin's political testament, which is about restraining Stalin, among other things, is suppressed. Krupskaya, his wife, and Trotsky cannot properly release it because the Communist Party structure considers it to be fraudulent. And the Communist Party structure is controlled by Stalin. Now, we have Stalin, who is the pragmatic politician. The first problem is that Trotsky is Lenin's natural heir apparent. He was the head of the Red Army. He was the chief propagandist under Lenin. Trotsky is considered to be a brilliant theorist. So, everyone's jealous of him. He's the big gun in town. Everyone is trying to get him. And so what Stalin does is he teams up with two old Bolsheviks, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Zinoviev and Kamenev together have a bunch of clout among the people who personally were Lenin's friends. And with Stalin's organizational support, Stalin tilts right, says that Trotsky is way too left-wing. He has gone beyond the canon of communist thought into this cloud cuckoo land of theorizing, and he's like a college professor, and you can't trust him. And ultimately, Trotsky is stripped of his power and has to go into exile. The man who saves communism during the Civil War, Lenin's obvious heir apparent, has to leave. Because if he doesn't leave, he knows what's going to happen. So, Stalin has persuaded Zinoviev and Kamenev that now that Trotsky's gone, he'll support them in the leadership. Oh yes, Stalin will support them. Well, actually, Stalin teams up with a guy named Nikolai Bukharin and says that Zinoviev and Kamenev are too far to the right. And that they are beyond the communist mainstream, and that they need to be overthrown because otherwise communism in Russia will be at risk. Now, Bukharin is another old Bolshevik, and he teams up with Stalin, and Stalin flatters him. Oh, you're so smart. I'm just a working bee. You're the king bee. You're so smart. And so Zinoviev and Kamenev are purged from power. They remain in Russia. Not a good idea. So it seems like Bukharin and Stalin are in charge. But then Stalin looks at Bukharin, and Bukharin has a rush of blood to the brain. And Bukharin voluntarily steps away from power. I'd rather write. I'd rather do what the party tells me to do. I don't really want to be a leader. Why don't we have the real leader step forward? Joe Stalin. So, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin is now in 1928, 1929, the sole ruler of Soviet Russia. And he is going to begin to make his power felt. Stalin never agreed with the new economic policy. He thought it was a mistake. He thought it was a step away from real communism. Besides, it reduced central power. And Stalin's at the center, and he wants all the power. So his first new policy is the forced collectivization of agriculture. Now, understand the degree of betrayal this is. Russian farmers were, for the most part, serfs until the 1860s, when at the same time that Lincoln frees the slaves, Tsar Alexander II frees the serfs. They are liberated. They no longer are property. They are free men and women of the Russian Empire. And for his liberalism, Alexander II was killed by assassins, including Lenin's older brother. So they're free, but they're still poor, and they're living on big plantations. So during the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks team up with the socialist revolutionaries to divide the great plantations up and give each farmer his own plot of land, which is all they wanted. They wanted their own plots of land to farm, like a human being, like an American family farmer. And after war communism, they get it. Under war communism, they're basically used. Everyone is. But from the time of the new economic policy in the early 1920s until the time of Stalin's succession in the late 1920s, there's this brief moment where the average typical Russian peasant farmer has control over his own farm, his own life, his own destiny. To the extent anyone has control over themselves in Soviet Russia, these farmers do. All of a sudden, every farmer has to become part of either a collective farm, a kolkhoz, or a state farm, which is basically, they're going to be serfs again. Now, a collective farm is better than a state farm. If you're on a collective farm, you have a local Soviet composed of the people who live on the farm. And under the commissar provided by the party, because everyone works for the party, the farmers can make a lot of their own decisions. Not all, but a lot. Well, as time goes on, they can make fewer and fewer. On the state farms, basically the government takes over and everyone who happens to be there is now basically a serf again, or a slave. The government orders what people are going to do on the farms. People do it, or they get taken away and re-educated. So people who had been serfs, had been freed, had finally been given their own land, now have all of that autonomy taken away by the Communist Party and by Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin's favorite biologist is a guy named Lysenko. And Lysenko, how can I put this? How would you raise crops that are resistant to the cold? Which is kind of important in a land that gets as cold as Soviet Russia. Well, Lysenko says what you do is when they're seeds, you keep them in a freezer or a refrigerator. And by keeping them in a freezer or a refrigerator as seeds, the plants will develop an immunity to the cold, a resistance to it, see? And what you can do is raise these freezer seeds, and they're going to be better, right? Now, if you know anything about biology, as we understand it, that's not true. That's like magic theory, okay? That's like saying, oh, you want to have tall beanstalks, so what you do is you keep them in a roof in the attic, and then when they grow up, you have them sprout up in the attic so that they're used to the higher elevation, the thinner air, and then when you plant them, they'll grow up, and it's nonsense. So Lysenko's theories are going to be implemented on the collective farms and on the state farms, but that's not all, because there's more. Stalin wants to break the power of the Ukraine as a separate region. So, his policies are going to particularly target them. And I will give you, for the last thing today, the word of the day, which is kulaks. Kulaks.
It's all in our notes.
And what kulaks are, they are the rich peasants who are the enemies of the people, according to Stalin. And we'll leave it there, and we will continue the story tomorrow. Kulaks, the rich farmers, Ukrainian farmers, the enemies of the people.
Lovely.
Thank you for your attention. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Yosef Vissarionovich Jugashvili, Stalin. Okay, we're set. Thank you.